And it's also left out the opportunity for the dying person to have conversations with their community about how they'd like to experience death, right? And how they'd like to be remembered, how they would like their death to be handled. And for me, coming into it, so much was about that sterility of death and that denial of grief, however it might show up for a person.
Hello, this is Cate Stillman with the Thrive with Cate podcast, and we're here for a conversation on midwifing death. And this is a conversation, we have a few experts in the house that'll do introductions so that you'll be able to recognize voices. And we'll share a lot of resources in this podcast show notes with various books and studies and references that will come up during the conversation. So for anyone who wants to go deeper into the topic and also to see the bios of the experts here, those will all be in our show notes for this episode. So I'm just going to start with a brief story and then we'll do a few introductions. I wanted to have this conversation because I know for so many of us, we're seeing our elderly increasingly with dementia and with having less choice, less agency, and less dignity in the process of dying. As a whole, we've seen this movement of both birth and death out of the hands of our families and out of the environments of our homes and going into often for-profit institutions which have various agendas that might be not necessarily in the best interest of those of our family members that are trying to peace out, trying to exit with agency and with dignity. And that's really what stimulated this conversation. I recorded another really short podcast really on the situation of my mother-in-law and recognizing that she didn't feel agency in her death, and a conversation I had with my cousin who chose voluntary assisted death with her mother for her mother's death. And they had to leave the country. They had to leave the US because there wasn't a way for her to legally die with dignity in the United States. And so they had to literally fly to Switzerland. And they chose the Pegasus facility in Switzerland so that her mother, who was in chronic pain for years, could leave this life. And so with my mother-in-law, we had intense conversations when she said, like, I want to die. And we went into the depth of the conversation, giving her agency back. And what that did is what I saw that did is it enabled her to die really quickly after having those conversations. And I didn't take that as a coincidence at all. And I also had my husband's and daughter's, I'm not even sure what the word is, but when we come together to support someone, that field of energy that's present, where a conversation can go into a place where a person can have a deep shift in their inner body awareness and in their own agency. And so just witnessing the power of all that, I realized that, like, a lot of my training in yoga, my training as a birth midwife, as in my training in enlightenment study, has enabled me to be able to facilitate a conversation both with my husband, my daughter, and my mother-in-law that enabled her to make that inner body shift and to be able to figure out a way to choose to die and then to do so rapidly. So I brought in some expert midwives. I'd love for Andrea and Becca and Heather to introduce themselves, and then we'll proceed with the conversation. Let's see, Becca, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can go ahead and go first. Hi, I'm Becca Nelson. I am a practicing death doula. I'm based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I practice both privately through my own practice, Partners in Passing, as well as a volunteer in hospice with a local hospice organization called Shalom Hospice. I did my training through an organization called Going with Grace. So that's led by Elu Arthur, who also has a book out recently about kind of her journey becoming a death doula that kind of pulls together everything that pulled me into the field as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Becca. Heather?
Am I the only Heather here? I think I am. I have a lot of personal experience in this realm with my two parents and my husband. So I'm very interested in this conversation.
Okay, excellent. And Andrea.
Hi, thank you for the invitation, Cate, to be here. I my journey towards holistic death care came through working in birth, which came through yoga. So all of this has been my sort of an extension of my spiritual practice and definitely my dharma. I feel like I've been led from one place to the other to the other. I worked I studied with Isha Oaks and I practiced postpartum Ayurvedic care around the world for about 12 years. And I did in-home care for up to 2 months at a time, from 4 weeks to 2 months at a time, most often in people's homes. And I and as a birth worker, when death started entering my practice, I found myself supporting couples whose babies had died in childbirth. I was on a midwifery path for a while, so I studied with midwives, in home and out of home, and licensed and unlicensed in different places, India and Arizona mostly. Um, and But as death started creeping into my practice, and then I started experiencing death in my life, I noticed the parallels between birth care and death care, and I felt like that was just a deep dive that could last the rest of my life. Um, the first death I experienced, I have as a really beautiful story I won't go into now, but I witnessed a completely unmedicated death with a young woman, 51-year-old woman who decided to take agency of her own experience, um, and decided to stop eating and drinking. And I witnessed her through and held her hand through that process. And that's when I realized that maybe this was a path for me to explore in my life. Not long after that, less than a year after that, I was holding my mother's hand at her death, and she had the complete opposite experience from here's a woman who has chosen her path and was walking it with courage and grace and awareness to the very last moment, to my mother in a hospital on morphine drip and needing to advocate to get her off the ID and just allow her to die finally, and no more MRIs in the middle of the night when she's days away from death. So I saw immediately, quickly, I saw the spectrum of how death could happen, and then I followed my aunt towards her death. And during that time between my mother and my aunt dying, I was in Toronto, and I was deep in the death and dying world, and also outside of my culture, my community, my subculture of wellness and yogis and artisans in Sedona, Arizona, and I was living in Toronto. So I decided to go to funeral school. So I'm a licensed funeral director and embalmer now in Saskatchewan, Canada. And I went that path reluctantly, but it felt like the best way to just learn everything I could about the subject and how it works and how people are choosing to die and why, and where did my mother go between the time I saw her in the hospital to the time I saw her in the funeral home. So I learned all those things and a lot more, and I will integrate them in some way in my life. Um, the So this question and meeting is very timely and interesting to me. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. I'm glad that you brought up about VSED, this voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. I think that's capturing my attention more and more, that this isn't something that we seem to know in modern culture, that and it's we are treated as consumers, right, rather than citizens more and more. And this shift from, and I just want to thank Peter Block and his work on community for really highlighting that and pointing that out and writing, I don't know, 10 books on that transformation and what that really means for us and what that means for humanity. And I do want to get into voluntary. I do want to start to highlight this topic, and actually I'll bring in some experts on this in a future podcast. I think part of the reason I'm so fascinated by this voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, and as a choice that I believe every citizen should know about and should be somewhat practiced in Club Thrive for the last few years. 4 times a year we do fast mimicking diet, and there's something of an ego death that tends to happen in a fasted state. So when we do fasting, even if we do fast mimicking, which is kind of like a pretend way of fasting that enables the body to enter autophagy and apoptosis, where our cells are up leveling, we do it for health. But to me, it's also it's like a gateway experience into practicing death and practicing the deep emotions that come up when we stop eating and drinking. Do you want to, I guess, Andrew, you probably have more experience with this. Do you just want to talk a little bit about voluntary, just for people who've never heard about voluntary stopping eating and drinking, and for the typical citizen who just wants to learn more, maybe like me, they have a family member with dementia who's in memory care or entering memory care and is really asking to die, like someone who's asking to die. I think we all have either in our extended families or in extended friend groups of the elderly, maybe know of someone who wants to die in dignity.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know anything about it before I met Danielle, and I was in her circle of care toward the end of her life. And she taught me. She was looking for an alternative. She and her husband were looking for an alternative to morphine. She was a very natural woman, a dancer, yogini. She wasn't sure about the idea of taking drugs. You know, she was dying at home. She'd chosen hospice care instead of chemo. She tried the morphine and it didn't work out well for her. So she and her husband went on the internet and found this VSED. I'm not even sure I've heard it said out loud before. Gosh, which I don't know what to say about it except my experience walking through it with her. It was a very conscious choice for her. She was at home in bed, slowly, so slowly dying. Her body was, she was losing a lot of weight. She got very skin and bones. She went through a long period, about 2 weeks, of what they call terminal agitation. And this is what people are given drugs for in palliative care. There was nothing to stop that. So she just went through the range of, like ego death after ego death. Pretty nonstop, day and night for, until she took her last breath. What was a few amazing things is to see this woman dying and have nothing on her bedside table except like a sponge for water. No drugs or nothing. Hospice nurses would come in to take care of her, just check in on her, be with her for some time. And she was quite afraid about how she would die. She didn't know. She thought, was something going to explode? Is it going to be suddenly? She's had all these questions for the hospice nurses. And this elder, I'll never forget this elder hospice nurse took her head in her hands really close and said, I don't know how you're going to die, Danielle. I've never seen this before. This senior hospice nurse had never seen a person die without any drugs, the way Danielle had chosen to die. So we just went on with it, supporting her in any way that we could think too. This is when I found that my birth doula experience and my yoga practice and training had trained me to be with her, and she recognized that also, which was pretty interesting. That as the days, but we were actually just getting to know each other during her hospice months. Well, we were community members before that, but in the same town. But she recognized that I had a capacity to be with her, and she left on my watch. What was having witnessed a few other deaths since then. I This woman had control over and was communicating till her last moment, agency over whether or not over urinating. Like, she told us, and we had to carry her to the commode, and she couldn't speak in the last couple of days, but at all, or maybe longer than that. But she could communicate that she needed us to help her get on the commode so she could at least do that on her own, and she did. And that that blew my mind. And to the last hours, whether she wanted to be covered up with a sheet or the sheet taken off. And wow, there was no doubt in my mind that she was 100% present at her moment of dying. And with every other death I've witnessed since then, I wonder if I will ever witness something like this again. It was such a profound, really a gift to be able to witness. And you asked about the SED. Yeah, that was. I'm in Canada, and MAID is like, oh, I don't know, even know, like, I don't know how many percentage of deaths are happening now in Canada due to medical assistance in dying. And there are lots of, maybe a lot of good reasons for it and a lot of good reasons not for it. It's really hard to put myself on that spectrum. But the fact that it takes away your consciousness and the possibility of consciousness on well, I don't know, maybe not, but on an awake level, I think that's a kind of a tragedy. I think we're like robbing people of the opportunity to be aware, and people don't even know that that's a possibility because, like you said, Cate, we don't know anything about alternatives. I would love for people to know that it's an option. Just like in my birth work, I felt like I was training people to, by the end of my 12 years or so supporting women in childbirth, I found like the most important thing I could do was to give women their choices, to let them know that there are different directions they can go, and they can choose whatever direction they want to go in. With dying too, there's that parallel that you can die this way. You can, yeah, it's kind of like the analogy of like unassisted birth and scheduling your cesarean. You can go get MAID, and you can do it this way, and it's really up to you. But people don't even know that they have that choice.
Well, and in the US, there's not many states that actually do have the medical assistance in dying, unless it's basically, if you have a 6-month death sentence at that point, as determined by your medical practitioner. Otherwise, you don't have that option. So for like my aunt, she was in chronic pain. The medications were not helping. She was at the end of her life. Like, she wanted to die, but she couldn't do medical. That's why she literally had to leave the country to have medical assistance in dying. I'm not sure why they didn't explore voluntary stopping of the eating and drinking. But I also know that without a practice of fasting, and to me, this is part of where there are I think what we see more and more with, again, this people here on this call, people in Club Thrive, they've taken agency back into steering their choices largely away from consumerism and into self-empowerment, as is true of most enlightenment communities, most self-care communities, where when we do that, we realize that there's all these practices that bring us more into both well, actually, I would say all of the rites of passages that are the quintessential parts of being human, that we have, that our rites of passages are as a species, our ability to ceremony and to witness intergenerational stages of ceremony are just like a crucial part of what's been taken away from us in the shift to consumerism, where, well, if we can make money off of birth, if we can make money off of vaccines, if we can make money off of early childhood care, if we can make money off of dementia, if we can make money off of dying, but it seems to be like that's a little bit of the situation that we're in. And as we're taking our agency back, there's these practices that were part of our species, that are just part of our primal, what I write about in Primal Habits, part of our primal nature, including these mini deaths that we do through fasting, that we do through detox, that we do through ceremony. Even, I would say, even like, I see Nicole's here. Nicole's a huge fan of cryo, as am I. Like when you get in the, when you bathe in ice water, there's like a little death that happens. There's like a ability to handle intense sensation. And to me, these are all practices for like, what is the difference between pain and suffering? What is the difference between suffering and fear of death? And to me, these are some of the bigger questions that we get to engage in as part of our natural primate nature, as we return into citizens and into our humanity and away from consumer, I don't even know what to say it, consumerism, consumer habits, consumer culture, the consumer mindset, maybe is also what comes up. I'm curious, Becca, what you want to add at this point in the conversation. I'm just going to give you the floor.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Andrea said so many beautiful things, and some of the things that really hit me both in what you said, Andrea and Cate, and what you said are around agency, right? We have choices, but consumerism has kind of taken those choices away. And culturally, we've been really kind of conditioned to deny death, right? To expect that when it happens, somebody will just take care of things for us. We don't have to think about it. And then that takes a lot of agency away from the people who are impacted by that death. When the system comes in and neatly sweeps a body away, neatly takes care of it and makes it look as real as we think it should, and neatly puts it in a pretty box and puts it in the ground and doesn't really engage with the community around that person to give real opportunities to remember that person, to grieve that person. It's taken care of in that 3 days and back you go to work. And it's also left out the opportunity for the dying person to have conversations with their community about how they'd like to experience death, right? And how they'd like to be remembered, how they would like their death to be handled. And for me, coming into it, so much was about that sterility of death and that denial of grief, however it might show up for a person. And I've, really had to find ways that I find meaning in these kind of practices that are set up to kind of strip meaning away and give us this very prescribed way that we go through these things. So coming back to agency and one of the powerful things, one of the things that I really love to do as a death doula is, people think that talking to a death doula is something you do when you know you're dying. But we have such a great opportunity. We all know we're going to die. This happens to every single one of us. And we have like lots of opportunities throughout our lives to reflect on what fears we have around death, what wishes we have around our life and around our death, and to talk with the people who we care for and who care for us about how that can be more meaningful. Right.
Yeah. Let's move into the conversation about lifespan and health span. So for those not familiar with the term health span. It's a term that's coming up more and more. There's more and more studies on health span versus lifespan. So lifespan is obviously how long you live, and health span is quality of life. So how long you have high quality of life. And what we're seeing right now in westernized countries that have these westernized medical systems that are largely, based on pharmaceuticals and to some degree on surgeries, is we see an extending, well, we actually are no longer seeing an extending lifespan. I know in Canada, it got a couple of years shorter recently, but we're actually dramatically seeing a decrease in health span. And actually, this is starting to hit people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, where we see more and more people that are very compromised in terms of what they can do day to day. That's in part due to the rising obesity rate in developed countries. And then it's also due to all the diseases of chronic inflammation that attack organs. So if we look at this conversation around health span and around increasing agency around health span, and then to me, it's like, what are some of these take-home tools that everybody can have with their elders? That's really where I'd like to go next. Is what are some of these conversation prompts? But also one of the things that I notice, and I know for me, and I heard Andrea mention it as well, is like the practice of yoga, these practices of being in intense sensation with presence and breath, with being embodied during intense conversations, that there's somewhat, I would say, for many people who follow me in this podcast, in this community, it's like you came here because you already had practices. You already had practices around meditation, yoga, around conscious movement, around conscious living. And my sense is this massive rise in as people embrace their health span, as people take agency back around discovering exactly what they can experience in their bodies, like what they can awaken, how empowered they can be in their body, that we are in many ways the most able to have these prescient conversations with elders or with people who are very sick with cancer or other terminal illnesses. So I'd just like to open it up to Andrea and Becca and anyone else with expertise that's on the call, in terms of how like the typical person who has a yoga practice or has a meditation practice might have enter certain conversation topics, but also use their practices in a way that facilitates these conversations.
So I can start with it a little bit. I think, one, in opening the conversations with folks who, aren't really so eager to have that conversation is pretty typical, right? And so making multiple openings over time, that patience of practice is really important, and that openness. And I think both in having the conversation and both in being in vigil at bedside with the dying, breathing is so important. Bringing that calm into the room is so important. And being able to center the person who's dying is really critical. People bring a lot of emotion into the dynamic of a dying person, into that person's room, into the decisions that person is making or not making about their healthcare, and being able to be somebody that can center that person. Knowing you have your own needs, you have your own emotions, but having a practice to deal with those kind of not necessarily separately, but differently than how you support that person who you might not be willing to have conversations about their death yet, or is building up their courage to. Is this really a safe place to express some of the thoughts? and for others in the room who might have a lot of nervous energy around it. And even for, I think about Andrea, you talked about terminal agitation. When I've been in rooms with people who are experiencing that agitation, um, I my breathing, my calm is so important because they will feed off of the energy that's in the room. And if you are distressed by their agitation, which is natural, their agitation is natural, um, like any bodily process, right? There are different phases that people go through. And this is where I think that, death midwife, there are a lot of similarities between birthing and dying. Right? That there are things that the body goes through, and agitation is often one of those. Um, so being able to be calm, be a center when that agitation is there. And coming back to the conversations, knowing what that person finds calming. So when patients have been able to talk about and people have been able to share in advance what brings them comfort, is there certain music? Are there certain readings? Do they like to be touched? Do they not like to be touched? Are there certain scents that they find good or they find disturbing? Those are things that then can come into the room to help um, center that person.
Beautiful. Yeah. Andrea, what would you like to add?
I was struck by the similarities between a birth scene in a birth room, a woman birthing in a room, and somebody dying in a room while you were speaking, Becca, and how with a woman during labor, our job is to, maintain our calm and our breath and be grounded um, and hold that vibe for her to come back to when she needs to. And it's very much the same. Very much the same scene now that I'm having flashes of both of these scenes in my mind's eye. It made me think also about how I've studied with Stephen Jenkinson of the Orphan Wisdom School up in Ontario, who's done a lot to raise this conversation in our culture. And he speaks a lot of what is a good death? And one of a big teaching that I received from him is that in our dying, in the way we choose to die, we teach others how death can be. And so I think about that as far as how that can raise the conversation and open up the possibilities for wondering what could happen, or how to approach the conversation around our own mortality. Some of the things I've done I'm establishing myself in a new place, a small town in the middle of Saskatchewan where I've never lived before. I began working at the funeral home, and I've had this. I'm not a conventional funeral home advocate, or it's not where I see myself being for the rest of my life. But I have this. I took this path. I have this license. So one reason I did it is because it sure is a good way to reach people. So in the past 6 months, working at this local funeral home, small town funeral home, I introduced not a death cafe, but there are death cafes, which a lot of people are attracted to start having these conversations. But conversations around dying, a monthly event that I brought in local people, clergy, people that are known in the community and I facilitated a conversation around circles of care. We talked about what is a good death. We had these. It was definitely an experiment in hosting conversations and not facilitated. I'm going to tell you what a good death is, but opening up just offering the subject to a circle of people. There were a lot of people who came in the really cold dead of winter here, and it was was really encouraging. There's really quite a buzz around it this fall and early winter. These kinds of things I think are really important. These death cafes, or in sort of other informal kind of death cafes, just giving people a place to talk about these things, and without even any answers in mind or formal, program, just host a conversation and keep that conversation rolling, really was my goal in doing that. Um, that's certainly that's the path I've taken here in my being who I am, which is kind of anomaly in this place, to start having these conversations and let people know that start to direct people towards what is possible, and having these conversations. People don't have anywhere to go with their grief, with their stories. It's there's so much to do in this realm. There's singing, there's a threshold choir. I just wanted to mention that too. That was, yeah, there are circles of care. Yeah, I saw your hand go up.
You want to say more about threshold choir? That's great. And Amy, if you want to unmute and join in too, please.
Do you know about the threshold choir, Amy? Would you like to speak about it? I have just a little bit of experience.
I live in southwestern New Hampshire, and yeah, I mean, I could say a lot of different things, but as far as the choir goes, yeah, we used to have two here within 50 miles, one in this small town and then another one a ways away. And my mother passed in 2019, and she always loved music and singing, and I had the choir come, and she knew all the people that were in the choir. It was just amazing, the peace that it brought her. And I was just, both of these have gone right now, and I'm just was thinking just the other day about we got to get those going again, because they're so soothing and beautiful. I did a hospice training a few months ago, and they talked a lot about one of these and how much joy it brought to people.
I just recorded a podcast with Kavita McMillan on singing as a primal habit, right? And it's like this return. We're having this wave, this like pushback against the consumerism, like this just natural return to like, wait, like how did we used to do this as a species? And so this important, yeah.
Cate, I'm moved by your talking about this. I studied anthropology in college, and it was so striking to me how far away we've gone from indigenous and non-modernized ways of doing things and knowing. It seems like our whole culture right now is in this kind of shocked phase of like, what do we do now? Because we've lost all these, I haven't read your book yet, but we've lost all these ways that were passed down from generation to generation with stories, and just the comforts and security that came with that within the community that we don't have in place anymore. So it's like we're fumbling in the dark. Those of us who are trying to move away, and people that are saying, wait, I don't want this consumerism thing. We're really, we're starting fresh in many ways, because there's still some of that alive, but I got the sense when I was studying anthropology and we'd study these peoples and these other cultures that they didn't have the same fear of death that we have. And I think that's a big piece of what we're dealing here is this societal fear of death that's been created. One, again, probably a lot by the consumer culture and the medicalization of dying. And I think one of the places that I find much comfort is in listening to the Coming Home channel, which has a lot of near-death experience stories, people sharing. Because they're all a great story. They're all just wonderful, uplifting, like you're going to be welcomed into these welcoming arms. And that's what it's really like, just like when we're born, hopefully. I mean, most people, I shouldn't say that, but anyway, birth is in an ideal situation. Birth is a wonderful experience for everybody involved. And I think a good death is probably like that. In fact, I think death is like that too, but we're afraid on this side. So we hold on and we.
Yeah. The klesha in Sanskrit of fear of death. So kleshas are considered a stain or something that pulls us away from our full consciousness or full potential. So abhinavesha is the is this fear of death. That there's a level where it's instinctual, right? Where we have instinct in order to keep us alive. And then there's this level where it gets in the way. With my mother-in-law, and I know everyone in this work, fear of birth, fear of death. A few things I want to say on it is, one is like when I was working as a birth doula, one of my first realizations was that like everybody that I knew, like their own childbirth was the first birth they'd been at. And that's how we know that when something's been taken out of culture. And often for people dying now, like their first death is their death is the first death that they've experienced, that they've been present during. Alex, I'd love to bring you into the conversation from your note that you were at the deathbed of each of your elders, and how different each of their deaths is. And I'd love to hear how you feel about your own death based on having already been present. Because I know, like, as a birth doula, I was much more prepared for my own birth, come what may, because of being at other births. The other thing I just want to say before I hand the floor over to Alex is that when I had cancer and I didn't know I had cancer and I was slowly bleeding out, I had a near-death experience. I was down 4 pints of blood, so about half of the blood a female adult body should have. And so I lost consciousness, and I was, all those near-death experiences we read about, that Andrea just shared a bit about, where there is this sense of this, I mean, whether we call it the bliss body or this deep presence, this deep loving presence, this real sense of A-okay. That's how I would describe it. Like, it's all A-okay. And I was at that place where I could feel like, oh, I could go either way, just in that bardo. Right. And so these, if anyone's read Tibetan Book of the Dying, or I have another podcast that we'll link in the show notes with Dr. Robert Sachs, where he walks through the stages from the Ayurvedic perspective of what's happening in a dying body. There's a shift, I would think, with those of us who have more experience between the actual fear of death and the fear of suffering, like the actual physical sensations. And this is sort of what I keep kind of coming back to for those of us who practice yoga and meditation. There's a lot of uncomfortable sensations that come up in our practices. And part of the reason we practice is so we can be present in discomfort, so we can get over our own very patterned, very limited idea of what it is to be. And we can become literally more flexible. We can become more able, and we can experience things that otherwise we can't experience unless we're willing to be uncomfortable, whether it's in cryotherapy, like sitting in ice water, whether it's, holding Agni Stambhasana for 3 minutes, like these things that we consciously engage in order to feel the friction and the edge, and to engage in the proprioception of fascia shifting and bending that allows these thousands of mini deaths, which enables us in many ways to start to separate death from bodily sensations, intense, and I'll put in air quotes, painful, because pain is a perspective, bodily sensations. Alex, what would you like to add?
I don't know. I think it's very useful to come from a very tiny, or let's say like a small community in terms of culture. What I learned, I mean, I'm from Barcelona. I'm from a big city. I had no idea about this till I met my wife, and she's a midwife. She lives in a small town, agricultural town, and I was drawn into this culture of death, where what it was normal. I mean, no one would hide or run away from. I mean, they would all even. I remember I think it was an auntie of my wife, that she was saying that she was like putting on some weight and that she needed to update her shroud. Is that the name? Shroud? When you dress Yeah. And then my wife would say, well, how do you say this? I mean, how dare you? And then she would say, oh, so you don't think you're gonna die? So it's not in your plans or what? When you become part of this culture where, I mean, if anyone dies there, they would keep the corpse in the house. They would close the streets and bring chairs so that people from all over, I mean, people would, they would work in the fields in agriculture, so they could not come till after dusk. But then people will make coffee. They would even have like um, kind of a freezer so that the corpse would not smell and that people could show respect in the house, shutting down the streets, filling it with chairs. Um, I've never seen such a what's the word? Like communion in terms of the whole society showing respect, which has nothing to do with what I've been faced to in Barcelona, where it's like quick, 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 let me out. So it's what I learned from that I took to my elders in Barcelona, because it was like half half, and it meant so much to me in terms of, yes, this is going to happen. I can hold their hands, and it's fine. And I'm preparing for my own.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah. I love that we've largely landed in the last hour is communion. In Primal Habits, when I was writing that book, and I'm like, what is the habit of communion? Like, hashtag commune. Like, what is this as? It's a verb, right? It's a noun and it's a verb. It's an activity. It's something that we do. And I would say that it's something that's been stolen from us with consumer culture, is this natural ability and awareness of how to generate communion.
It's tribal,
Right.
but this is so much easier in a small community.
Yeah. I hear, or it's easier in a community where it hasn't been lost.
Exactly. Exactly so, yeah.
Because I see it in Mexico too. I see exactly what you're talking about. The chairs, the house, the street clothes, the community, and even in bigger towns. But if it hasn't been lost, yeah. So yeah.
I just want to throw out, I too am challenged with I'm working with a woman who has dementia right now, and I think that's a really, really difficult. I'm curious if Andrea's had any, or any of you, Becca, has had any experience with that, because they're not, it's a whole, they're in a different world. And both my parents had dementia at the end of their lives, and I ended up midwifing my father across the threshold, but he was he was confirmed atheist, which I think is part of what added to the problem, their relationship with God. But anyway, just the whole dementia piece is quite challenging. I heard, I know you said, Cate, you're dealing with that.
Well, and that's part of, and I will host a completely separate podcast just on that, because dementia just due to our food, due to having seed oils in our food. This is largely what's served in nursing homes or in assisted care facilities, that we're actually plaguing our elderly, not just our elderly population, but like every part of our intergenerational population with the seeds of dementia. That's why we're seeing dementia earlier and earlier. We're seeing brain fog earlier and earlier. We're, now it's called, this whole type 3 diabetes as dementia, where we have this increase of amyloid plaques in the brain, and we know it's diet driven. And yet, for most of us with our elders, they're there may be a time when like we just cannot, it's too ingrained in the system, and the system is making a lot of money, a lot of money. I know just even the transition from, being in a nursing home to being in memory care, and the increase of cost of that. And there's no way to exit. This is the thing. There's like no way to exit if the body's healthy. I think this is the thing that's just not really understood by citizens of what's happening to their elders, is they can enter this phase where they can't actually assist anymore. And like there's no a way for the person with dementia to volunteer. So now they're just stuck in the system. Yeah, go ahead, Heather.
I went through the real dark side of this piece of dementia with my mother. And it's still really painful to talk about. And it kind of goes back to what Becca said at the beginning, that people don't know the alternatives. But I think there's a lot of people who don't even know what happens in that mainstream medical system and what the reality is. And I kept my mother in private care for almost 3 years, for as long as was financially possible. And then she went into a nursing home, and she was non-mobile and non-verbal for 4 years. And it was excruciating to witness. And she was on hospice in the nursing home for 3 years, which is an incredibly long time. And she weighed less than 75 pounds at the end. And what I learned is, if you're in the nursing home on hospice, they will not stop feeding you. And it has to do with, I think it's state laws, but they have to continue to offer you food. And so, and this goes back to something else we talked about at the beginning, is that that volunteering to stopping and eating, and even if that's something that someone with dementia decided that they wanted to do prior to having dementia, it can't be done, because when you have dementia, you can no longer make that decision whether you're going to eat or not. And if they're just putting food in your mouth, then you're going to keep eating as long as your physical body is responding.
Right. There's this primal instinct that's overridden when we don't have conscious choice.
Right. And witnessing that, I mean, it still gives me chills, because it's a horrific, like, no-win situation. And
well, actually, can I just ask, because I'm sure you've thought about this, Heather, and we haven't connected for a little while, but is there the choice to then take her out of the facility, let her die at home, and not have, and what comes up with that? Because I'm guessing that's what people are asking.
Right. And that's where, things get really complicated. My mother died in July. And I was also taking care of my husband at home. My mother was in a different state. But when all of this was sort of coming to light, that they actually won't stop feeding her in the nursing home, the only option is to take her out. But where do you go? My father had already died, and he died in a hospice hospital 2 years prior. So there was no house where she was living for her to go to. So the only option was to bring her to our home, 1,000 miles away. But in order to get her here, I had to pay $6,000 to have her medically transported privately. And so if you don't have those financial options, then you stay in the nursing home. And at the end, I mean, I just knew my mother wanted to die, but she wasn't dying. And so in the end, I did move her here, and she died within a week.
And she did, yeah.
I mean, she was ready. But at that time, I was also caring for my husband, who had just been diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer. And he died this past October.
Yeah.
And I was able to care for him at home and keep him at home and be curled up with him when he did die. So it between my father and my mother and my husband, they were all very, very different death experiences. What I saw with my parents, there's a lot of legal and financial stuff that gets tied up in all of the decision making for, what's the best decision when somebody hasn't made the decision for themselves and a family member is left being the one to kind of, like, I was just trying to make the best decision that I could for them. But with my husband, I was able to stay with him. He was able to be at home and not be in the hospital. He was on hospice, which is a really wonderful service. But again, and then it goes back to something that I think Becca was talking about. When somebody can no longer get out of bed and can no longer do anything for themselves, just and again, this is where I think my practices really have helped me be able to stay present, especially with the transition with my husband. That when you're having to like face the reality of caring for a dying body, and hospice is not there 24/7 to do that, and so it can be and a lot of people think that they are, and so I have just seen that it's like it can be a really stark reality for the caregiver to go through. I was already had been in boot camp for a lot of years in the caregiving, so I was prepared for that and caring for my husband. But in just talking, to friends or talking to people in my community, it's very clear that so many people don't understand any of the like anything that happens because we are so culturally terrified to talk about it.
That's where the death cafes are really good. That
Yeah.
really, really important. Yeah, just get the conversation going.
Right.
Excuse me, Kate.
And I don't know, and maybe it would my father was in such deep denial about dying, so that I don't know, I felt like I was trying every avenue to kind of get the conversation going, but it just like if somebody's not talking about it, if they're that shut down or that disembodied, then it really it's a difficult place to be in. But I think you're right. The more that those conversations can just become more normalized, so it's not so fearful to talk about, then that change can start to happen.
For over, I believe now 25 years, I've created tip sheets and little ebooks where I've found just a massive gap in what we know and what we should know. So I think we will create one on midwifing death for the average Joe or Jane, because I think we're all going to see that this becomes increasingly important in an aging population with dementia, and in a culture where death has become a consumer ritual rather than a ritual of families communing. I know there's more to talk about. We've come to our end as far as like the first round on this one. If anyone has resources, I will add them. Any books, resources, etc. We'll put them in the show notes. I also will start to create a little ebook or tip sheet series on this, and would love to include any resources or references that any of you have found helpful, because to me that's really probably the next step in this. And then anyone who wants to be involved in a conversation on voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, we'll do an episode just on that, because to me that's just also seems like a massive missing chunk what we should know as primal humans, and being able to maybe choose that for ourselves and our own planning of our own death, maybe if that is decades away, but to still maybe plant the seed that we always have some level of agency. Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you for your contributions, Andrea and Becca and Heather and Alex and Amy. Yeah, for the sake of time, I'll just say to be continued.